Michael, you're just not executive material, Brandon said, his voice carrying across the boardroom like he was announcing the weather. I'm Michael Thompson, 48 years old, and I'd been sitting in that same conference room for the past 22 years, watching guys like Brandon climb over people like me. You're solid on operations, don't get me wrong, but vision, strategic thinking, that's not really your wheelhouse. The presentation was still running on the screen behind him. My presentation. The one I'd spent 3 months putting together for the Hartwell Industries contract renewal. Brandon had his back to the projector, gesturing at slides that contained my analysis, my cost projections, my implementation timeline. 12 board members sat around that mahogany table, including his mother, Patricia Walsh, in her navy suit and pearl earrings, and not one of them said a word in my defense. I didn't argue, didn't even clear my throat, just sat there and let it wash over me while something clicked into place in my head. You know that moment when you realize you've been playing a rigged game? That was it for me. 22 years of showing up early, staying late, fixing problems nobody else wanted to touch. Started as a floor technician fresh out of the Navy, worked my way up through every department in this building. And here was Brandon Walsh, 35 years old with his Harvard MBA and his family connections, taking credit for work that had my signature on every page. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was watching him flip through my technical specifications like he understood what a bearing assembly actually did, or how our legacy systems interfaced with the new automation equipment. This was a guy who'd never spent a day on a production floor, never had grease under his fingernails, never gotten called at 3 a.m. because line 2 was down and we had a deadline to meet. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my office past the photos lining the hallway. Pinnacle Industries through the decades. Founded in 1948, family-owned until the private equity buyout 5 years ago. That's when people like Brandon started showing up, fresh from business school with their talk about optimization and scalability. Meanwhile, guys like me who'd kept this place running for decades suddenly found ourselves explaining our own expertise to kids who thought manufacturing was something you could learn from a textbook. I opened a new folder on my desktop. Called it Equipment Maintenance Schedule because Brandon never looked at anything that sounded like actual work. Inside, I started documenting everything. Every email, every project timeline, every client interaction that Brandon had somehow claimed as his own strategic initiative. See, Brandon had this thing about making everything sound revolutionary. Digital transformation, operational synergies, customer experience optimization. What he really meant was, Michael does the work, I repackage it with fancy words and present it upstairs. The board ate it up because Brandon knew how to talk their language. He'd stand up there in his tailored suits talking about paradigm shifts while I was in the factory at 5 a.m. making sure the actual paradigm didn't collapse. Take the Hartwell Industries situation from last spring. Their production line went down on a Friday afternoon, custom bearings that nobody else manufactured, and they were looking at a week of lost production if we couldn't fix it. Brandon was at some leadership retreat in Colorado, posting LinkedIn updates about strategic visioning sessions. Meanwhile, I drove to Hartwell's plant with a toolbox and a laptop, spent the weekend reverse engineering their assembly process, and had them back online by Monday morning. 6 months later, Brandon presented the Hartwell turnaround to the board as an example of his crisis management leadership. Made it sound like he'd personally diagnosed the problem and implemented the solution. Never mentioned that he'd learned about it from my after-action report, or that his only contribution was forwarding my summary email to senior management with a subject line that read, "Successful client intervention per my oversight." The funny thing about being invisible for so long is you start noticing patterns, like how Brandon's innovative cost reduction strategy was actually the same process improvement plan I'd submitted 8 months earlier, or how his client retention breakthrough was built entirely on relationships I'd spent 2 decades nurturing. He'd take my quarterly reports, run them through a translator that fixed the bearing problem in line 3 into implemented predictive maintenance protocols, then present it like he'd invented preventive maintenance. I started keeping track, not because I was planning anything dramatic yet, just because I wanted to see the pattern laid out in black and white. Turns out, every major win Brandon had claimed in the past 2 years traced back to my department. Every efficiency gain, every satisfied customer, every cost saving that made its way into his PowerPoint presentations had started with me solving problems the way I'd learned in the Navy: identify the issue, develop a solution, execute the plan, document the results. That documentation habit was going to serve me well in the weeks ahead, though I didn't know it yet. The breaking point came 3 weeks after that boardroom humiliation. I was in the break room refilling my coffee when I heard Brandon talking to Carlos Rivera from finance. Carlos was one of those guys who wore expensive watches and called everyone chief, the type who'd moved over from corporate after the buyout to optimize our financial processes. They didn't notice me behind the vending machine, too busy with their conversation to pay attention to the guy in work boots. $485,000, Brandon was saying, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Plus incentive bonuses if the Hartwell deal performs like I'm projecting. Not bad for 18 months of work. Carlos whistled low. Nice bump from your current base. What's your secret, Chief? Good delegation, really. I set the vision, let the operations guys execute. That's the difference between management and leadership. You hire the right people, point them in the right direction, then take credit for the results. He laughed at his own honesty. Simple formula, but not everyone gets it. I stood there holding my empty coffee cup, listening to him describe my work like he was some kind of conductor, and I was just another instrument in his orchestra. $485,000, nearly $500,000 for a promotion based on achievements that belonged to me. The Hartwell deal he was bragging about? I'd salvaged that account single-handedly when their production line failed, and they were threatening to pull their contract. But it wasn't just Hartwell. Over the past 2 years, Brandon had systematically repackaged every major success from my department as evidence of his strategic leadership. The Morrison Steel efficiency improvements that saved them $200,000 annually. The Lakefield processing automation project that reduced their error rate by 60%. The preventive maintenance program that cut downtime across our client base by 35%. All of it traceable to initiatives I'd developed, problems I'd solved, relationships I'd built through decades of showing up and doing the work. When I got back to my office, I opened my equipment maintenance folder and started a new document, Q4 Performance Attribution. I began listing every project Brandon had claimed credit for, cross-referencing them with my original work orders, email chains, and client communications. The pattern wasn't just obvious, it was systematic. He wasn't taking credit occasionally. He was strip-mining my entire department's output and rebranding it as his strategic vision. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about a guy getting promoted to VP of operations based on stolen work, while I stayed stuck at the same level despite doing the actual heavy lifting. And if he made VP, that would put him in charge of the entire operations division, including my department. The thought of reporting to someone who'd built his career on my accomplishments made my stomach turn. I didn't get angry. Anger would have been useless. Instead, I got methodical, started making copies of everything. Email threads showing my direct communication with clients. Project files with my digital signature and timestamps. Performance metrics that trace back to my process improvements. I even started recording some of my client calls, documenting conversations where plant managers specifically requested my involvement on upcoming projects. The more I dug, the clearer the theft became. Brandon had a system. He'd wait for my quarterly reports, then cherry-pick the most impressive results for his monthly presentations to senior management. My detailed technical summaries became his strategic insights. My client feedback became evidence of his relationship management excellence. My cost savings became proof of his operational efficiency initiatives. But he made mistakes. Corporate types always do when they try to steal technical work. Like the time he presented my bearing replacement protocol as his predictive maintenance innovation, except he mispronounced 3 technical terms and confused hydraulic systems with pneumatic ones. Or when he claimed credit for solving the Morrison Steel quality control issues, but couldn't explain the root cause analysis when the plant manager asked follow-up questions during a site visit. That's when I realized something important. Brandon didn't actually understand the work he was stealing. He understood PowerPoint presentations and buzzword bingo, but he had no idea how manufacturing operations actually functioned, which meant if I ever decided to leave, he'd be exposed pretty quickly. All those client relationships he claimed to manage, they were built on my technical expertise and 2 decades of reliability. The efficiency improvements he took credit for, they required ongoing maintenance and adjustment that he couldn't provide. I started thinking about Keith Banner, the recruiter I'd met at the Manufacturing Expo last year. We'd exchanged business cards, had a brief conversation about industry trends. He worked for Apex Manufacturing, Pinnacle's biggest regional competitor. Family-owned company with a solid reputation and old-school values about promoting from within. The kind of place that appreciated experience over MBA credentials. During my lunch break that day, I looked up Apex online. Their senior leadership team was full of guys with backgrounds like mine. People who'd started on the floor and worked their way up through actual expertise rather than corporate politics. Their CEO had been with the company for 30 years, started as a maintenance technician. Their VP of operations was a former plant manager who still kept his hard hat in his office. I found Keith's contact information and sent a brief email. Nothing dramatic, just a note saying I'd been thinking about our conversation and wondered if he had time for coffee sometime. Professional networking, the kind of thing people in our industry did all the time. He responded within 2 hours. Michael, good to hear from you. Actually been hoping we'd reconnect. We've got some opportunities opening up that might interest someone with your background. Free for lunch Thursday? I was free for lunch Thursday. Very free. That night, I went through my files again, this time with a different purpose. Instead of just documenting Brandon's theft, I started cataloging my own value. 22 years of client relationships, technical expertise that couldn't be learned in business school, a track record of solving problems that saved companies hundreds of thousands of dollars. For the first time in months, I slept well. Thursday's lunch meeting with Keith Banner took place at Murphy's Steakhouse, a no-nonsense place downtown where guys in our industry went to talk business. Keith was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. Old habit from years of recruiting. Always want to see who's coming through the door. Michael, he said, standing to shake hands. Good to see you again. You look like a man with something on his mind. Keith was about my age, maybe a few years older, with the kind of weathered hands that told you he'd worked his way up through the ranks too. He'd started at Apex 15 years ago as a production supervisor, moved into HR, then specialized in recruiting technical talent. The kind of guy who understood that manufacturing expertise couldn't be taught in a classroom. We ordered steaks for both of us, coffee black, and Keith got straight to business. I'll be honest with you, Michael. I've been hearing your name around the industry for years. Good things, client loyalty, operational efficiency, the kind of reputation that takes decades to build. Jim Hartwell mentioned you specifically last month at the suppliers conference. Said you personally saved their contract last spring when their line went down. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Part of the job. Maybe at your place. At Apex, we call that exceptional performance. Keith leaned forward. We're expanding our Midwest operations, and we need someone to head up the new division. Senior director level, reporting directly to our VP. It's a step up from what you're doing now, and the compensation reflects that. Base salary of $145,000 plus performance bonuses that actually go to the people doing the performing. The number was $20,000 more than my current salary, but what caught my attention was the respect in his voice. When was the last time someone at Pinnacle had talked to me like my experience mattered? There'd be one expectation, Keith continued. We'd want you to bring your client relationships. The real ones, not just names on a spreadsheet. People who trust your judgment enough to follow you based on the work you've done for them over the years. I had those relationships. Hartwell Industries, where Jim still called my personal cell when problems came up. Morrison Steel, where the plant manager had specifically requested my involvement in their expansion project. Lakefield Processing, where I'd solved 3 major production issues in the past year alone. These weren't Brandon's connections. They were mine, built on late-night troubleshooting calls and keeping my word when delivery schedules got tight. I'd need 2 weeks to wrap things up properly, I said. Keith smiled and extended his hand. Fair enough. Think about it. But I didn't need to think about it. Walking back to my truck, I already knew what I'd do. The question was how to do it right. Back at Pinnacle, I started putting together my transition plan. Not the kind they teach you in business school, but the kind that makes sure nothing gets lost when you walk away, and ensures proper credit gets assigned where it belongs. First, I documented every ongoing project in detail, not just status updates, but comprehensive records showing who initiated each project, who developed the solutions, and who maintained the client relationships. The Hartwell bearing replacement protocol that Brandon loved to mention in meetings. I had the original engineering notes, the client communications, and the implementation timeline with my signature on every page. The Morrison Steel efficiency improvements. I had emails from their plant manager specifically thanking me for going above and beyond and solving problems our previous vendor couldn't handle. The date stamps showed these conversations happened weeks before Brandon ever mentioned Morrison in his reports. For each client relationship, I created what I called a transition summary: contact names, relationship history, project details, and, most importantly, documentation of who they actually worked with day to day. These weren't just business contacts, they were professional relationships built over years of delivering results. I also started making copies of Brandon's presentations, cross-referencing them with my original work. The pattern was even clearer when laid out systematically. Every strategic initiative he'd claimed credit for traced back to projects I'd initiated, developed, and implemented. He was like a corporate parasite feeding off work he couldn't have done himself. But I was careful. Everything I copied was my own work product or communications where I was a primary participant. Nothing confidential, nothing that would violate any actual agreements. Just documentation of who did what, when they did it, and how the results were achieved. Janet Cole from compliance stopped by my office that Friday afternoon. Janet was one of the few people in the building who understood both the technical side and the business side of what we did. She'd started in quality control, moved into regulatory affairs, and now handled internal audits and process documentation. "Michael, got a minute?" she said, closing the door behind her. "I've been reviewing some of the project attribution reports for the board, and I'm seeing some inconsistencies. Mind if I ask you a few questions about the Hartwell situation?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "What would you like to know?" According to Brandon's summary, he led the crisis response team and personally managed the client relationship throughout the emergency. But when I look at the actual documentation, all the technical work orders have your signature. All the client communications show your email address. The thank you letter from Hartwell is addressed to you personally. I kept my voice level. "The documentation should speak for itself, Janet," she nodded slowly. "That's what I'm thinking too." "Michael, between you and me, there are questions being raised about some of these project reports. The board wants accurate attribution, especially with promotion decisions coming up." After she left, I sat back in my chair and looked out at the production floor through my office window. 22 years in this building. I knew every piece of equipment down there, every process, every potential failure point. I'd trained half the supervisors, mentored dozens of technicians, solved thousands of problems that kept this place running. And none of that would matter if Brandon got promoted. He'd take credit for everything I'd built, everything I'd accomplished, everything I'd earned through 2 decades of showing up and doing the work. Time to make my move. Monday morning, I walked into Diana Foster's office with a manila folder and a resignation letter. Diana had been with Pinnacle for almost as long as I had, worked her way up from secretary to HR director through the same kind of steady competence that used to matter here. She was one of the few people left who remembered what this company used to be like. "This is unexpected, Michael," she said, scanning my 2-week notice. "Any particular reason for the timing?" "New opportunity. Better fit for my skill set and experience level." She nodded, then opened the folder I'd placed on her desk. Inside was my transition documentation, 47 pages of detailed project histories, client relationship summaries, and what I called attribution clarifications. Every major achievement Brandon had claimed in the past 2 years laid out with timestamps, email chains, and supporting documentation that showed who actually did the work. Diana's eyebrows went up as she flipped through the pages. "This is very thorough, Michael. We appreciate the professionalism. Just want to make sure nothing falls through the cracks during the transition." An hour later, I was back at my desk when Brandon appeared in my doorway. His face had gone pale, and he was holding a printout of my resignation letter like it might bite him. "Mike, what's this about?" "If it's about the VP position, I'm sure we can discuss other opportunities within the company." I looked up from my computer. "No discussion needed, Brandon. I've found a situation that better appreciates my contributions." "Where are you going?" His voice had an edge to it now. "Apex Manufacturing, Senior Director, Midwest Operations." The color drained completely from his face. Apex was our biggest regional competitor, and he knew exactly what my client relationships were worth to them. More importantly, he knew he couldn't maintain those relationships without me. "You can't take our clients with you. There are non-compete clauses, intellectual property concerns." I smiled for the first time in months. I'm not taking anyone anywhere, Brandon. I'm just informing my professional contacts about my career change. What they decide to do with that information is entirely up to them. Over the next 2 weeks, I had a lot of those conversations. Professional courtesy calls to let people know about my transition. Jim Hartwell thanked me for 5 years of reliable service and asked for my new contact information. Morrison Steele's plant manager mentioned they'd been frustrated with Pinnacle's recent communication gaps and wondered if Apex might be interested in discussing their upcoming expansion project. Lakefield Processing's operations director said they preferred working with people they knew and trusted, regardless of which company name was on the business cards. I didn't recruit anybody, didn't make promises or guarantees about future partnerships, just had honest conversations about my career move with people I'd worked alongside for years. The kind of professional networking that happens every day in our industry. Meanwhile, Janet Cole's compliance review was picking up steam. She'd presented her preliminary findings to the board the Thursday before my last day. Word was getting around that several major project attributions were being questioned, and senior management was asking uncomfortable questions about accuracy and performance reporting. Brandon had stopped making eye contact with me in the hallways. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like panic. During what should have been his victory lap before the VP promotion, he was instead fielding questions about project timelines and client relationships he couldn't adequately explain. Diana called me into her office on my final afternoon. "Michael, there's been some discussion about the documentation you provided. Very detailed work. The board appreciates the thoroughness, especially given some questions that have come up about project management protocols." I kept my voice level. Happy to help ensure a smooth transition. There may be some follow-up questions after you leave. Would you be available for a brief consultation if needed? Of course. Professional courtesy. I cleaned out my desk quietly. 22 years of accumulated files, photos, and mementos fit into 3 cardboard boxes. No speeches, no dramatic exits. Just packed up my career at Pinnacle Industries and walked out to the parking lot like it was any other day. As I was loading the boxes into my truck, Keith Banner called. "Michael, welcome to the Apex family. When can you start?" "Monday morning." "Perfect. Oh, and you'll be interested to know, Hartwell Industries called this morning. Jim specifically requested that you handle their new facility project. Apparently they're not too happy with the service transition planning at your old company." 6 weeks into my new position at Apex, the industry newsletter ran a small item about executive transitions and compliance reviews at major regional manufacturers. No names mentioned, but people in our business knew how to read between the lines. Word was that a certain VP candidate at Pinnacle had been placed on administrative leave pending completion of an internal audit. Several major clients had raised concerns about project management and communication protocols. I didn't gloat, didn't send any messages or make any calls, just focused on my new job and the clients who had chosen to follow me to Apex, built the kind of operation I'd always known was possible when you had management that understood the difference between actual leadership and PowerPoint presentations. Brandon's promotion was quietly withdrawn. From what I heard through industry contacts, he was reassigned to strategic planning while the board completed their review. Corporate speak for figure out if we need to call our lawyers. Turns out that when you build a career on other people's work, eventually someone notices the foundation is hollow. And when that someone has spent 22 years documenting everything, keeping detailed records, and maintaining client relationships based on actual performance rather than fancy presentations, the house of cards falls down pretty quickly. These days, I sleep well. Apex appreciates what I bring to the table. My clients get the service they expect. And somewhere across town, a 35-year-old MBA is probably learning that vision without execution is just expensive daydreaming. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people see who's really been doing the work all along.